Bread and pizza dough have quite different textures and structures, right? But what if you could make both from the same batch? In this video, I'll show you how I use the pizza app to mix one dough for both pizza and bread. Let's see how it turned out. For this recipe, I'm preparing the entire batch first, then dividing it into portions for both bread and pizza after mixing and resting. So, I've set up the app for a single dough ball weighing 1,250 grams, just enough for 2 pizzas and a medium-sized loaf. I start by dissolving the pre-measured salt in a small amount of warm water. Once fully dissolved, I add the remaining water. But to keep the dough cool for longer, I'm using a combination of cold water and ice. Next, I gradually incorporate the pre-measured flour, adding it bit by bit as the ice melts. This allows the dough to hydrate gradually. Normally, I'd add the yeast, in this case, mother dough, directly into the water, but for this recipe, I'm mixing it in slightly later with the flour. Since bread dough typically requires more moisture, I'm working with 70% hydration here. But with increased hydration comes the need for a stronger flour, which is why I'm using Caputo Cuoco for this batch. This recipe also works with fresh or dry yeast. Just make sure to adjust the app settings accordingly. Now that extra moisture makes the dough trickier to handle. But why? Hydration plays a key role in the texture and structure of both bread and pizza. While they may seem quite different, they actually share a lot in common. Both rely on gluten development to create an airy, well-structured dough. However, because bread dough contains more water, it requires stronger gluten formation to maintain its shape. Pizza dough, on the other hand, typically has lower hydration. It needs to be stretchable but not overly sticky, and strong enough to hold its form when baking. This is why flour choice is critical. Higher hydration doughs require a flour with higher protein content to maintain structure. That's where Caputo Cuoco comes in. Its higher protein level helps develop elasticity and strength, which is crucial when working with dough at 70% hydration, whether for bread or pizza. Now let's move on to mixing. Instead of adding all the water at once, I start by dissolving the salt in a small amount of warm water. Then I gradually introduce the rest as a mix of cold water and ice. This serves 2 key purposes. First, it keeps the dough temperature under control, preventing overheating, which can weaken gluten and make the dough overly sticky. Second, the slow melting of the ice allows for gradual hydration, ensuring the flour absorbs water evenly, giving the gluten enough time to develop properly. Since higher hydration dough takes longer for gluten to form, using a hand mixer is a great advantage. Initially, the dough appears rough and sticky, but as the gluten strengthens, it gradually comes together, becoming smoother and more elastic. I continue mixing until the dough reaches around 23 degrees Celsius. This increase in temperature is a natural result of friction from mixing. This is an ideal range, warm enough to encourage fermentation, yet cool enough to maintain dough strength and make handling easier. With mixing complete, I check the dough temperature, around 23 degrees Celsius, which is right where I want it. Now it's time to let the dough rest for 20 minutes. This brief pause allows gluten strands to relax while hydration continues, making the dough more workable for the next stage. After resting, I transfer the dough onto a lightly oiled countertop. Since this is a high hydration dough at 70%, handling it requires a different approach than lower hydration doughs. Quick, confident movements are key to preventing excessive sticking. I begin by folding the dough, a technique that strengthens gluten while maintaining the dough's airy structure. Using wet hands, I lift the dough from 2 sides, allowing it to fold naturally under its own weight before slapping it down onto the counter. Then I repeat the process from different angles. This method gently builds tension on the dough's surface while redistributing air inside, resulting in a stronger, more cohesive structure. After a few rounds of folding, the dough forms into a smooth, elastic ball. At this stage, I let it rest again for another 20 minutes. This cycle, folding and resting, is repeated 3 times in total. Each round further enhances dough strength, improving elasticity and gas retention, which is crucial for both bread and pizza. With the dough fully developed, it's time to portion and shape it for both pizza and bread. First, I divide 2 dough balls, each weighing 270 grams, just the right size for Neapolitan-style pizzas. Using a gentle twisting motion, I shape them into smooth, round balls, ensuring the bottom is well sealed. Once formed, I place them into a plastic proofing container, lightly oiling the surface to prevent drying. The lid goes on, and they are left at room temperature for 3 hours before moving to the fridge for a 20-hour cold fermentation. This slow proofing process enhances both texture and flavor, making the dough easier to work with when it's time to bake. With the pizza dough set aside, I move on to shaping the remaining dough for bread. First, I laminate it, stretching it out on a damp countertop to create an even sheet. Then, I fold 1/3 of the dough from the right over the center, followed by the left, forming a 3-layered strip. This layering builds structure, helping the dough maintain its shape during the final rise. Next, I roll the dough tightly into a log, similar to shaping a croissant, ensuring a firm yet delicate roll. The sides are pinched to seal the layers, locking in air and creating the tension needed for a good oven spring. The shaped dough is then placed into an oval proofing basket lined with a cheesecloth dusted with flour. To prevent drying, I enclose the basket in a plastic bag before leaving it to proof at room temperature for 3 hours. Like the pizza dough, it will then head into the fridge for a 20-hour cold fermentation, developing a deeper flavor and a well-structured crumb. Fast forward 20 hours, and it's time to bake. We start by placing a glass Dutch oven into the oven and preheating it to 250 degrees Celsius, 480 degrees Fahrenheit. After about 30 minutes, it's fully heated and ready for baking. My fiancée, Claudia, carefully removes the preheated Dutch oven and sets it on the counter. She then takes the proofed dough out of the fridge, removes the plastic covering, and then she places a sheet of parchment paper over the dough, then flips the proofing basket to release it onto the counter. The loaf holds its shape perfectly, with a smooth, taut surface. After brushing off any excess flour, she gently lifts the dough with the parchment paper and transfers it into the hot Dutch oven, trimming the excess paper to prevent burning. Using a pair of scissors, she carefully snips an expansion cut across the top. This allows controlled oven spring, helping the bread rise properly. The lid goes on, and into the oven it goes, baking at 250 degrees Celsius for 45 minutes. A quick time-lapse shows the transformation. The dough expands beautifully, developing a crisp, golden crust. When the time is up, Claudia takes out the Dutch oven, revealing a perfectly baked loaf. The crust is deep brown, well-developed, and crackling slightly as it cools. She carefully transfers it to a wire rack and gives it a light misting of water, enhancing the crust's texture and shine. Finally, she rotates the loaf for the camera, showing off its beautifully baked form. With that, the bread is done. Now, it's time to move on to the pizzas. I took the dough tray out of the fridge a bit earlier, giving the dough about 2 hours to come to room temperature. Due to the higher hydration, the dough balls spread out more to the sides and rose slightly less, but they proofed well overall. With higher hydration, stretching needs to be adjusted. After dusting the first dough ball with flour, I use a spatula to lift and flip it onto my stretching mixture. I gently reshape it into a more rounded form, then flip it again into the semolina so the original top side faces up once more. Flattening the center, I transfer it to the counter. To stretch the dough, I lift it and place it over my fists, gently rotating it while letting gravity do the work. This method helps it expand naturally without tearing. Once it reaches the right size, I brush on a mixture of smashed garlic and water, drizzle it with olive oil, then slide the peel underneath. After a final stretch, it's ready for the oven. As soon as the dough hits the oven floor, it starts to rise, forming delicate air pockets. I check the bottom with the turning peel to ensure an even bake, then rotate it 180 degrees. This helps prevent burning and promotes uniform cooking. After another 10 to 15 seconds, I continue turning it gradually, allowing the crust to develop a balanced golden color. To enhance the browning and add depth to the flavor, I lift the pizza closer to the heat source for a final touch. The olive oil on top helps crisp up the center, creating a beautiful contrast between the crunchy base and the soft interior. Once baked, I take it out and turn it into Lángos, just like in my last video. If you want to learn more about Lángos, check out that video. For toppings, I spread a layer of sour cream, brush the crust and center with garlic water to enhance the aroma, then sprinkle on Parmesan and mozzarella for extra creaminess and rich, cheesy flavor. To finish, I add finely sliced red onions and fresh green onion rings for a touch of sharpness and color. The crust has that signature leopard spotting, and when I cut into it, the cross-section reveals a light, airy structure with a crisp, well-baked center. A perfect balance of texture and flavor. Now that the bread has cooled, it's time to see how it turned out. Listen to this. That's exactly what we want to hear. Let's cut into it. The crumb looks airy and well-baked, though the larger air pockets suggest a slight under-fermentation. Despite that, the texture is great, the crust is beautifully golden brown, and the flavor is spot on. A solid result overall. And that's how I make both bread and pizza from the same dough using the pizza app. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll leave you with some footage of the second pizza baking. It came out a bit egg-shaped, but flavor-wise, it was an absolute banger. Drop a comment below and thanks for watching. See you in the next video.